Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm just recording this intro prior to anything going on because I do want y'all to know that this is a serious issue and it's also a growing issue about the trans, quote unquote, trans children type community that's going on in today's world. And honestly, you'll see what I'll mean in a second during this small interview with Brenton Netz, and this is regarding his son Miles and what is going on with that. And I'll link everything in the description below as far as the GoFundMe, the YouTube page, the Facebook page, everything, just so y'all can go check it out for yourselves and not just take my word for it and also the interview words for it, but also see what other people, including the father in general, are saying within this community, just to raise awareness, especially when it comes to kids with autism and how this is affecting them. So, thank you all for listening to this small disclaimer and introduction before I get into it. Um, anyway, have a good day, and I'll see y'all at the end of the video or during the video or next video or whatever. Peace. Alrighty, and we're now recording the audio for this video. Today I'm here with Brenton Netz, who's the father of Miles, and for this case, I really want to spread awareness for how you have many trans children out here today, and so on. So, yeah.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm Brenton Netz. I'm Miles' father. Save Miles. Hashtag SaveMilesGortz.com. Or hashtag SaveMilesGortz, and then the website is www.SaveMilesGortz.com.
Alrighty, thank you for letting me have you on today.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me, and I'll talk to anybody. Thank you so much for caring.
You're very welcome. Is there anything you would like to say first before getting into this questionnaire interview-esque thing?
Well, I'm trying to get decent at doing these interviews. Also, I'm normally a pretty reclusive person, and I'm having to kind of press my limits on going out and talking to people and talking to the public. But I've never been so motivated because kind of everything depends on this. My son's in a really bad place, and it's similar to the Save James campaign. So Jeffrey Younger down in Texas, where in his case, that James's mother is convinced that one of their twin boys wants to be a girl and is threatening chemical castration, puberty blockers and such. Well, my son's mother is the same. She's been treating him as a girl since about age 3. And I never knew where this was going to go. It kind of can happen under your nose and sneak up on you, and it just keeps getting worse. And so by age 7, my son's mother started taking him to a gender clinic, and it's just getting exponentially worse from there. Would that be a good start?
Yes, I think that would be a good start. As well as, one question I had was, especially knowing how autism works, with how some children with autism would have certain fixations on things that would be considered abnormal for someone to, have a specialized interest in. And this can go from, shows or whatever, and people tend to correlate that with being trans. And I was wondering, do you think that's one of the key elements that caused his mother to actually do that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of the key factors. So it's looking like, everyone's kind of playing catch up on this because it's happening so fast in our society, and the affirmers are not giving people a chance to really look at the data and do research and understand it correctly, I think because of their agenda. But it is disproportionately hitting autistic children. And in my son's case, that manifests as he has an obsessive personality. Mm-hmm. And if he gets fixated on something, like you said, which is a great word, it's really hard to break him off from that. And so in a way that kind of got used against my son, where his mother started pushing him towards traditionally girl things like Disney princesses and dolls, and then later on dresses and and girl clothes, and then growing his hair long and stuff. And so it starts to become this kind of blurring of cause and effect, where the child starts looking like, let's see, how do I put it? Always trying to find a way to explain this properly in the best way. But, the other side sees it from a completely different perspective. They think that this is a natural occurrence, that the child was born gay, or the child has, what's called gender dysphoria, which I don't even entirely believe of that diagnosis. But really, it's that it just gets pushed on them early. At least it was in my son's case. There might be different, ways that people get to this point. But, then all the manifestations start happening, and then when the gender clinics get involved, they just kind of capture the child and put them in a little bubble where it's all they see. They see cartoons with trans children. They start affirming it. They take control of the language. They take control of the identity. They change the child's name. I mean, it's a real cult. If you look at what, people that have researched cults, I mean, the trans movement takes every one of those monikers.
It definitely does sound like that, especially with how it's affirming them into it. I remember Jillian going over how affirming sounds a lot like what people would refer to with what's the word? I can't remember now. The conversion therapy type stuff. Like, that really just seems like they're trying to sugarcoat it.
Yeah, it's like brainwashing or gaslighting. I think those are another two words that can accurately be applied to this. And what they have done, like Jillian and I, he sees this all and talked about this a little bit, is they have branded anything that's not affirming, meaning, so like affirming therapy would be just, they believe the child has gender dysphoria, and they believe the child's identity is different or the opposite of their biological sex. And so then they're pretending like they can actually meet those two in the middle through hormones and such, which is a whole other crazy part of this. And they will brand anything that's not affirming as conversion therapy, which has gotten some bad, it's gotten some bad press in the past, because people have, it's like when Christians, for example, have tried to convince homosexuals that they're not homosexual and so forth, which, very well might be valid, but it's gotten a lot of bad publicity. And so they've taken that, and states are now outlawing anything that they want to call conversion therapy, including trying to not affirm a child of their gender dysphoria, even though, and I know I'm being long-winded here, but it kind of ultimately results in people are realizing that if you just leave a child alone and you let them go through their natural biological puberty without any chemical castration or puberty blockers, up to 90% of the time, this stuff just works itself out automatically.
Exactly.
It just kind of alludes to the agenda that they have. I call it the beat puberty game. They're always trying to beat puberty, because they know that once puberty kicks in, that's when hormones kick in. That basically, it's what makes boys attracted to girls and girls attracted to boys and so forth. And so they know once that kicks in, they're going to miss their little window of time to capture that child. So that's why there's the whole push for the puberty blockers. That's my take on it. I think it's based on logic.
Yeah, I was honestly thinking the same thing, especially with how children in general, like, they have their own emotions too. However, they're still coming to themselves, and usually, especially when it comes to sexuality or even being trans, they have to go through puberty in order to know if that's actually how they feel or not. And
Absolutely.
That's a lot of things that deal with that, and people like to put in, like, oh, puberty blockers are there to push forward and have them have time to explore their identity, but that's not really the case. They're exploring their identity as they grow older and so forth and so on.
Yeah, I think you have a really good understanding of it. I think the two biggest lies that the trans cult uses is, one of them is that you can actually put a pause on puberty, or push a pause button. I've seen that said from their side, that it gives the child more time to figure out whether they want to let their biological puberty happen, or they want to stop it, and go the other direction. but that's just not the case. I mean, the experts are. Dr. Michael Laidlaw is the guy I always go to, and he's right on top of this. And he's an endocrinologist that's pushing back against his own profession, and there are others too. There's just no such thing as pushing a pause button on puberty. It's just too important. It's common sense. Everybody that knows this, except for people that are just deep drinking the Kool-Aid in the trans cult.
Exactly, and that's what I'm thinking too at this point, especially like with how, especially in my generation, being part of Gen Z and seeing the upcoming generation of Generation Alpha, I'm seeing how this like whole identity, so to speak, is actually being pushed upon my own generation, and mostly done in a way like, oh, you have to do this to feel better, kind of like what I was hearing with the interview that you had with, what was her name? Let me go through here because I made some notes while watching that video.
Sure.
Lynn.
No hurry at all.
I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
Lynn Meeker?
Yeah, that's right. I was definitely agreeing because I've noticed a lot of stuff like just in general with some kids I knew who went to public school, they deal with a lot of social hierarchy with it being about sexuality other than what they're talented in or so forth or so on. So that's another thing I like to address. Like that is something that I'm seeing that is a major issue.
Yeah, no, it's a really complicated subject. It's hard to get one's head around it and understand, what's the truth and what's being, pushed on us with the agenda. And I'm still trying to figure it out myself. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, in my opinion, it comes down to parental authority, and it comes down to parental consent. And so when we're talking about children, it still is the case that children can't go join the army at 10 years old. They can't buy cigarettes at 10 years old. I mean, there's a litany of things that they can't do because they're still considered minors that do not have the ability to consent. Yet, this trans cult is so powerful, and it's got so much money behind it. It's got it's so politicized that they're actually steamrolling what's left of parental authority. And my case is a perfect example of that. Jeffrey Younger's case is an even better example of that. In my opinion, if they pull this off, I mean, if there's I believe Jeffrey's case is kind of a precedent in setting case in this regard because it's so well known, that if they go ahead and push their agenda right past his parental authority and everything he's done to try to keep that intact, this means a lot more to society in general than people realize. I mean, they're basically, what they're claiming is our children are not ours and they belong to the state.
Yeah, and it's definitely, especially whenever you mentioned the parental consent, especially with that being taken away. I remember you mentioning about how they're not allowing you to hear the audio recording or even just video recording of your son's therapy sessions, but at the same time, for you as a parent, you should be able to witness what's going on or know what's going on in general behind closed doors.
Yeah, they can't even keep it straight themselves. So I have established parental custody of my son before this stuff really started ramping up. When my son was about 3 years old, I went through the Stearns County Family Court System in central Minnesota, and I have in black and white language explained in a document from the family court that I have joint legal custody of my son, and I have, and his mother has sole physical custody, and I have what's called visitation rights. And so, by definition, the joint legal custody defines that I have equal say, 50-50. It even uses that word, 50-50, meaning the schools can't, if I object to something, they have to get my permission. If the medical system, if I object to something in the medical system, so on and so on, religion. Well, that has not been the case. I have been told by every one of those institutions that they only need one parent's consent, and if I have a problem with it, I have to go through all the trouble to petition the court, which I've done 3 times in the past 10 years, which has gotten absolutely nowhere. And I can tell you that how the courts handle it. So this all kind of comes down to a bottleneck of the family courts. They become like the strong arm of this process, where they're the enforcers of the law. And so how they've done it in my case, and I'm not quite sure how they've done it in Jeffrey's case, but for me, they've said, well, because we have kind of a tie and there needs to be a tiebreaker, we defer to experts. And experts in this case would be the gender clinic. So in my case, it'd be Troy Weber Brown, who is the gender therapist, supposedly. So you can kind of see how it just once again kind of falls in their direction where, Troy Weber Brown is never going to side with me and say, well, Miles is too young and he has lots of other problems that have nothing to do with this. And, so it's like they've got this bias built-in system where whatever parent is supporting this or affirming this gets the muscle behind them to enforce it, and the parent that's outside of it gets left in the they get their rights violated. So
yeah, and that's pretty much like what I'm seeing, where people are considering it child abuse to not be affirming to that issue. However, it's like a parent deserves to be concerned and have a word to say about their child is my major belief on that. But it's just like at the same time, I'm here looking at how the court system and along with the medical system is now, they're doing a lot of things secretly that don't even like help with parental consent, or even just like letting parents know, hey, your kid has something this going on or anything like that, and the kid's like really young too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I've been trying to, you're young, and I imagine that maybe some of your listeners are around your age, and so I'm moved to maybe throw this in here, is that I think it's really important for I know, like, I was young once too, and I know it's difficult, when you're young with everything going on, but it used to be that our families and our parents used to guide us up to this point, so we didn't have to necessarily be put on the spot to make these decisions. And it is so important that if a person is going to couple up with somebody and start a family and have children, there is really nothing. There's no other choice a person can make in their lives that's going to affect them more going forward than who they do that with. And so, in a way, my case is and Jeffrey's case and a lot of other cases similar, is that we're kind of like a cautionary tale. I don't want to speak for Jeff. Jeff's got kind of a different thing going on, but for me, I will put myself in that case for sure, is that I'm kind of a cautionary tale. I chose badly in the sense of I chose a partner that had opposing views on the world. Now, at the time, I didn't really know that because I was in college and I was kind of liberalized, and I kind of have a different perspective on life now than I did then. But what could keep a person out of this mess entirely? I know I'm being kind of long-winded, but I really want to be thorough on this because it's so important, is that if you're out there and you're of that age where you're, interested in other people and you want to couple up and think about having a family, which I think is what we're here for, just make sure, ask them these questions. You got to add it on the list of, like, what do you think of puberty blockers? What do you think of trans children? If you don't get anything other than a resounding no, it's evil, it goes against, all logic, all reason, all reality, God's word, you might want to just pay the bill and run, because that's how you're going to get into messes like this. And you just don't want to, because what it'll end up doing is completely consuming your life. It'll bankrupt you. It's a terrible mess. So, and then what I'll put on top of that is, if let's say you are smart enough and blessed enough to find a proper partner that thinks knows this is wrong, like you, I do believe it's getting to the point where you can't even interface with the traditional institutions of our society, such as the public education system. Most of even like the churches, there are still good churches out there, but a lot of them have been co-opted, and they're 501c3 charities, basically. The medical system has to be handled with kid gloves, because if they start, pushing some of their agendas, you're going to lose control of your children. So it's kind of getting down to, if I had to do it again, I'd kind of go like the Amish route or the Mennonite route. I'd just really kind of join a group of people that's just staying out of the system and being self-sufficient. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes a ton of sense. Let me see. Another thing is like I kind of noticed with your video pattern on your channel, which, again, I'll have the link in the description. For the most part, I noticed like how your son's behavior changed from being very nice to very vulgar. And I'm here kind of wondering if that is the case with how long he's been seeing Troy Weber Brown as his therapist.
Yeah, it does seem to follow the same timeline. See, my son does have some behavioral issues having to do with quite a few things. I mean, most of them not. I mean, none of them are really his fault. At the end of the day, autism can make for a strong-willed child and a personality where he his fixations that they don't get to kind of go from beginning to end. He gets frustrated. There's a lot of anxiety that comes along with that. And my son's in a lifestyle, unfortunately, with his mother, where it's very regimented. I mean, he just gets woken up too early. He gets rustled off in the car with a breakfast bar in his hand, and it's just the whole day is kind of an onslaught of rigidity. And so that's not really working with his personality, to say the least. And then, so when he acts out, it kind of becomes his. If you think about it, there's like there's so much to say about this, so it's like I feel scattered sometimes. But like Jilly and I had this going on with our interview. It's like we've had so much to say, we could have probably spoke for 3 hours and tested everybody's patience. But basically, it's like there are so many. I call them parasites. There's basically people out there that they're making their living off of what they would call like working with children and working with autistic children and children with problems. And I kind of I understand that all sounds nice and everything, but no one can really fix, like in my case, no one can really fix my son's problems. I mean, it's except for me, except for his mother if she had her head screwed on straight. But the system, relies on kind of feeding it with these children, and so they don't really have an incentive to fix their problems. And so in my son's case, and I think this is probably happening, more than we know, is my son has these emotional issues that have to do with his autism and has to do with his lifestyle, his anxiety and such, and also they have him over-medicated, is at some point the system kind of gives up on the child in a way. And so what it looks like to me, and this is the case I'm going to make when we go to court, is that with all of the medical documents I have spanning at least 3 years, is that they put this gender dysphoria diagnosis on a child to kind of redirect or to put an umbrella over it. So it's like now my son doesn't get any what could possibly be helpful real counseling and help. He just gets taken to a gender therapist, which then has the agenda of like saying in a nutshell, all of my son's problems will go away if you just allow us to give him chemically castrating drugs. Does that make sense?
To me, like, with how they're reasoning with it, it doesn't make sense at all, because especially when it comes to mental problems, whether that's anxiety or even just being mentally disabled, like let's say with autism or Down syndrome, there's no really fixing what happens within their brain, especially dealing with someone, me personally, with taking care of my uncle who has Down syndrome with us. It is really challenging to actually deal with that. However, we have to give him as much love and also discipline as we can, but we can't believe every single thing he says, if you put it into that terms or anything like that.
Yeah, it goes into the other thing I mentioned a while ago, that there's two kind of like nuclear options that the other side uses. One of them is that there's actually a pause button on puberty, and the other one is that the suicide rate. So what they do is they scare the pants off of everybody, usually the parent, the affirming parent, of like, if you don't allow us to give your child puberty blockers, your child's going to commit suicide because the suicide rate is so high compared to the average population, which is true. But you can kind of see that what we're explaining right now, just they reverse cause and effect is what they do. So it's the child gets so mishandled and so stuck in an agenda, and just before they even know what's going on, before their identity is even formed. And then, imagine waking up in your 20s and you look down and you've allowed somebody to castrate you, either physically or chemically or both, and you become an abomination that doesn't fit in anywhere. Of course the suicide rate is going to shoot through the roof. So it's like, this is what, I'm not going to stop whatever it takes to stop my son from being a victim of this, and hopefully bring enough attention to my son's case to kind of be a path in the wilderness for other parents that might find themselves in a similar situation coming up. And so This is an absolute nightmare. I mean, this should not be happening to children. I mean, this has all the markings of the eugenics cult.
Exactly. And I honestly, as soon as like you started mentioning like someone being in their 20s and waking up realizing that, hey, they made something wrong or messed up in their life, that kind of reminds me of the David Reimer case that happened like last decade or so. Well, not last decade. Pretty much like during like the 1980s, the 90s, somewhere in that, where a kid was literally, thanks to a botched circumcision, was kind of forced to become a girl. In a way, they had like a whole like gender study therapist just to kind of prove like, oh, gender is learned, not biological. However, it is biological, but the people out there still use this person's, I guess their, what is it called? I can't think of the word at the moment.
Yeah, I do know the case you're speaking of. I haven't looked too deeply into it, but I know it gets, referenced a lot. And yeah, I mean, the trans cult in a nutshell is they believe that gender is a construct, and it's kind of a mindset. And what I'll say is, our side is, for lack of a better word, is that we know that there's such a thing as biological reality, and there's a night and day difference between being a man and a woman. And that's what they don't want to acknowledge.
Exactly. And I think, yeah, it's called, the dude's studies, like, or the doctor's studies, rather, excuse me from having informal stuff, or speaking, or whatever. But it's just like the doctor's studies are always used for these gender clinics. However, they don't look at the outcome of that man's life and not realizing, like, once he got in his 30s, he ended up committing suicide because of what happened to him.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a lot of detransition. I'm sure you already know this. Maybe your listeners don't, though. But there's a detransitioner movement. So, excuse me. There are people that have gone through this back before we had this explosion of the epidemic. 10 years ago, and they transitioned and then they regret it, and so they're trying to detransition as much as they can possibly can. And there's a lot to learn from those people. Excuse me. Sorry.
You're fine.
And we should be listening to them. Everyone should be at the edge of their seat listening, including the other side. But they won't, and they aren't. And which just shows, once again, this is a cult that's, that has an agenda, and they're in the process. Even though they're a small percentage of the population, they have such political clout behind them. They have such mainstream media clout behind them. And they have so much pharmaceutical money behind them. They're just kind of steamrolling over what most of the population is abhorred by.
Mm-hmm. I know for a fact right now, I know there's like a small trans community on YouTube that are generally very common sense type people that recently had, I think, the same person on their channels. I haven't watched their videos yet, but I'm a fan of Blair White in general because I enjoy her content, because sometimes she does go over certain things that are happening in the world that most of the time mainstream media won't cover. But for the most part, you had it where she had a detransitioner come onto her channel and talk about why they're detransitioning and so forth, and I plan to watch that video later on today.
Yeah.
But it's just like, you do have people that are like trying to get this side heard, so I'm thankful for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, Blair White's such a great example and such a great resource because, hopefully people will listen to her then, they won't listen to us. And very common sense. And, it's an example of, so what Blair White says is it works for me and I'll never have it any other way is what I've heard, but I would never push this on children, which is kind of the opposite of what a lot of this narcissism is coming from the other side, is that they just can't seem to get it out of their head. It's like, just because this is what they want to do or they think they want to do, they're going to push it on children like that's the case too. It's just like narcissism unbridled. So I very much appreciate what Blair White has done to talk some common sense on that side.
Definitely, and it's, even though like a lot of people like to call her transphobic for that or anything like that, but no, it's really just people being outright concerned for these kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And this problem could be solved. I call it kind of like the magic bullet or the silver bullet in this, is that if parental authority was enshrined like an amendment, It was right up there with the First and Second Amendment in the Constitution. We would see this problem almost completely go away. There are still going to be some parents who are going to do it anyways. I mean, we're seeing that now, but at least in cases where the parents are split on this, it's you can't steamroll parental authority, because what that does, it opens the Pandora's box for like, okay, now pedophiles can come and convince your child that, of anything, a vulnerable child, and then it might come to the day where a pedophile can just knock on your door and say, "I'm going to take your 10-year-old out on a date," and you're like, "No, you're not." And he's like, "But he says it's okay, and you don't have a say in it." I mean, it sounds ludicrous, but that's essentially what they're proposing and what they're setting up the groundwork for.
It is about to get to that point. I truly believe that, because really it's just, you do have some people, like, they do prefer a younger person. However, most of the time when it comes to that, they don't prefer minors. But you do have people who want to normalize being with a minor, and really that just, even as someone who's not a minor now, but it's just like seeing that today and seeing how my generation is growing up with it along with the generation coming up, I'm dumbfounded by it, because I'm just seeing how these kids out here are probably out doing their own thing and just not realizing the consequences of it, especially with different things going on. So that's like a huge issue. I believe one of the ladies that goes out in California and does a lot of, like, I guess you can call it like making sure, like, anti-feminism-esque stuff. I can't remember her name, but I know she had a post she put out there of how California had this thing in their booklet for sex ed, and it went over not only like anal, but along with like different things that you wouldn't let a 8th grader or below know.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you don't show this to a kid.
It's like it kind of supports what I said earlier about, at this point we can't interface with especially the public schools, because I mean there probably is still some public schools in some areas who have not been corrupted, but we're hearing enough stories now where this is becoming kind of common core, where I've made this argument from the beginning that children in general are just not sexual. They're asexual, by nature. Like until puberty happens, as long as they're not being messed with, as long as not being exposed to it, children don't really think much in one way or the other. And so what they're doing is I think there's a nefarious agenda to steal our children's innocence, and they corrupt them early, and then they can kind of control these people for life. So they and that's the agenda behind that too. Like if you can get a person on cross-sex hormones, for example, they're a customer for life. I mean, we haven't even touched upon the subject of big pharma. Is already making billions of dollars on this, and it's not even started yet. I mean, if it ramps up and we're not able to push it back, big pharma is going to be controlling, large swaths of the population with daily injections or weekly injections, and I mean, it's a nightmare. It's something right out of a dystopic novel.
Yeah, you're exactly right on that, especially, even though, like, I'm not really the economist or anything of that nature, I do realize, like, a lot of stuff with pharmaceutical companies, if they give you something that you get hooked on or have to rely on, they charge you more than what needs to be charged, obviously, and they're ranking in a lot.
Yeah, and then what if you can't say no? What if your physiology is now dependent upon it because they put your body on them before puberty? Then they can control you. They can say, well, we'll turn off your Medicare if you don't, if you don't toe the line. I mean, people. There should always, I'm a self-sufficient person, and it makes just common sense to me that, like, if I want to have freedom in this life, I got to be as self-sufficient as possible. And what it seems like is there's just what's wrapped up in this whole move is they want to make everybody dependent. They want to be dependent on peer pressure, on affirmation, on drugs. It's just a big dependency movement to control people.
Exactly, and that's, like, not only with I guess you could call it the hormone treatment, but it's also like in different medications as well. I believe that whenever you can easily try to make yourself healthier, however, you do have people who do need certain medication to go by, obviously, but for the most part, they keep people hooked.
Yes. Yeah, it's these are hard times to come together and form families, and there's a lot of bad energy in the world. I know that Jilly and I talked about this briefly. It would be interesting to have more time with her. Maybe I'll get to talk to her again. I hope I do. But there's at the end of the day, there's also this other element of this looks like a big depopulation agenda. And I don't mean to be panning out the scope of this, too large or too far away from my son, and I don't mean to do that. At the end of the day, I kind of have two focuses for what I'm trying to do, which is one, to tap the opinion of the court of public outrage, which is what Jeffrey Younger did and what he showed me could happen. Before Jeffrey Younger's case in Texas, the St. James case happened, or he pushed through the media blockade, people really didn't know this was happening. There were some people that are being personally affected by it, but I thought I was the only one. This was happening for years, and I had to kind of keep it to myself, and there's a lot of family and friends even until recently I didn't even mention it to, because I didn't know how to approach it. It was kind of embarrassing. I lost control of my family, And but so Jeffrey did us a great service to kind of blast a hole through the wilderness and get this started. And but my secondary hope is that in the process of just doing my little part in the world and talking to you and talking to anyone that'll listen, is that I do believe this is going to get bigger and this is going to become a bigger problem. Lynn Meager says that we only have a few more years, left to beat this back, because there's an entire generation being threatened by this, and I agree with that. And she also says that it's kind of like a iceberg where we're kind of seeing the stuff that's peeking over the top, but there's a lot. This is affecting a lot more below the surface on our society in general. It's threatening our civil rights. I mean, they're trying to make. I mean, just listen to some of the Democratic candidates. I mean, they're actually pretending like trans rights are like the civil rights of our era, and it's like, I mean, these are just hyperbolic, outlandish statements, and we should all be alarmed.
Exactly, especially whenever you look at it along the lines of civil rights. Trans people, we never told them they shouldn't exist, or even homosexual people, quote unquote, shouldn't exist, or anything like that. We never told them that or anything. We just treated them as human. And I think as soon as I guess the 2016 area, maybe a bit prior to that, whenever it started to gain up there with social media presence like Tumblr or DeviantArt, and I used to use DeviantArt a lot since I do a lot of art stuff, but it's just seeing that now and realizing hey, this is something I did grow up with, and seeing how this whole identity politics are pushed onto us, especially to a young audience, it is pretty confusing, along with very concerning to me personally, because it's just some stuff that I realize I talk about, especially whenever I don't mean it in a way where it's against my religious beliefs, but at the same time it's just kind of I don't want to offend this person because I don't know their life struggle.
Yeah, it is scary. My son, maybe going back to when I was saying this stuff can sneak up on you and be happening right under your nose, and that's why I understand people that don't, this becomes a big surprise to them, and they sometimes come to the wrong conclusions. I have family who actually think right to this now that what I'm pushing against is that I don't want my child to be gay. I don't want my son to be gay. And I have to explain to them, that's that's not correct. If my son was going to be gay, I would accept that. If that's just the way it is, that's the way it is. I wouldn't prefer it because of a lot of what comes along with that lifestyle, but I would accept it, and I would see it not as a problem. But we're talking, this trans stuff. That's why when they attach the T to the end of the, LGBT, and there's a lot of LGBs that want nothing to do with the T. They don't want to be associated with that, because we're talking about something totally different. I mean, and so that's what I keep trying to get across to maybe I don't know, the boomer generation that kind of had different battles, and they don't quite understand how this problem has metastasized, and but it's interesting to listen to you, a younger person, talk about this and your experience of kind of growing up in this world where this is normalized in the deviant art. And my son, he used to always ask me to look at my phone, and he'd ask me to punch stuff up, and I'd be like, okay, and I just punched up while we're whatever, shopping, and he'd always pull up deviant art pictures, usually of Disney princesses and stuff, and I'd be like, well, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking some of them would be, kind of like I don't know, like there was a segment of it where they're like zombies and stuff, and I remember just thinking, I'm not sure if I like him looking at this, but in retrospect, I would have probably just taken all screens out of my house if I could go back. But I know that's how it sneaks into a lot of the younger people's minds. It becomes like water to fish. It's like you can't explain what water is to a fish because you're a person just swimming in it, and it becomes kind of like their reality.
Exactly, and this is even like as a young person, as you mentioned, it's just like I'm here seeing that as growing up with like the same type of social media and such, and you brought up how there were Disney princesses as zombies and stuff on DeviantArt, and I vaguely remembered there were people that put like very fetishized drawings out there of the same princesses, whether that be in a grotesque manner or in a quote-unquote tasteful manner. And it just like people get paid to make those things, intentional or not. It's still kind of ingrained into subconscious territory if you're very young looking at that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you said it just right. That's true. It's like, from a child's perspective, it's like you're allowing me to look at this, so this must be acceptable. That's where it comes back to parents have to have authority. It's like, and I'm not coming from a righteous place. It's like, if I would have known, where this could go, then I would have been a lot more protective, and I would have, shielded my son from this. Of course, I would have had to have been with a partner that was wanting to do the same. You have to be a united front, but it just keeps coming back to this, like, if young people are worried, they're looking at the world, and I do hear this a lot of like, why you can't have kids these days? It's just, it's just too dangerous. It's too hard on kids. It's like, I agree with that, and I used to say that for a long time, but if we all stop having kids, where do you think this is going to go to, right? And especially if we don't have good kids that are well adjusted, and it's like, so I do believe the answer is to live, kind of this separate life where you're protecting your children from these influences, because they're creeping in from everywhere. If something has a screen and it can be turned on and that child can access it, it's guaranteed that that entity is going to enter. If they go to public school, it's almost becoming, it's becoming standard issue now that someone's going to come into that school, a drag queen. Now they're even sending in gender therapists and starting to, and make it inclusive into sex ed. And like you said, even younger and younger ages. It's like there is a massive push to get our children to start thinking about these things before they have ever any right to.
Exactly, and it's really just disappointing for me, and I'm right now where I'm at the point of boycotting a lot of entertainment stuff, and though that limits my view on what I can watch, it actually has helped me see more into different things going on with society, especially, like, I'm gonna use Disney as a primary example, and I plan to make a video in the future of why I decided to try to boycott Disney as much as I can, especially their new media. But for the most part, they put a lot of effort, obviously, but a lot of stuff in there that's just like, they're pandering to nostalgia so much that they want to keep everyone into a conditioned state of not wanting to look around them. And that's something I'm noticing, especially with live action remakes, Disney Plus being available, and so forth and so on. They're just trying to condition it to, it's like, oh, you're only looking in this one direction. Kind of like how a horse has one of those little...
the blinders.
Yeah, the blinders and all that, so they can look straight other than around them whenever they're walking.
Yeah, no, it's I wish I was better at making videos, but I did, aim my phone at my screen and tried to capture a few points to get people thinking that there are a lot of cartoons out there now that have transgender characters, and this is intentional. This has been happening longer than anybody just known where it's going to go, like since the 90s. The Troy Weber Brown, the gender therapist who has control of my son at the moment, used to give him homework where he would say, watch 5 Sailor Moon episodes between now and the next time I see you. And you can see how they just have this kind of like cottage industry behind them to make sure the blinders, like you described, are on the child at all times, where they can't look and start to compare away. You catch the child during their formative years and when their identity is being formed, and then you start adding in autism, which can be very obsessive. It's like I'm concerned. I mean, I'm going to try. I'm going to do the best I can, but I am concerned. My son is so far down this rabbit hole. He's been led down this rabbit hole so far. It's going to be a huge challenge to try to bring him out of it, even if I get a chance to do so. So it's it's a mess. I mean, it is a total mess. One quick thing I'll add to that is that there actually are now industry standards are kind of like being built into the industry of making cartoons and so forth, where it's even mandated that every cartoon has to be representative of the population, and that would include having a transgender character in it.
Yeah, and that's also another point too, with how children's media today is being forced into that. And it's just kind of like, I can understand like probably an adult show or adult cartoon or whatever having a trans character or a gay character or so forth and so on in it. And there are times whenever I look at children's shows and I kind of don't like that they put romanticized characters in it or any like coupley type characters in it, because it's just meant for kids. Give them something that kids can relate to, not a romance interest.
Yeah. It's just it's propaganda. It's I think it's really safe to say that the only people that want a child to be thinking in any sort of sexual terms, whether it be heterosexual, homosexual, well, there's a word for that. It's called pedophilia.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the only people that want children to have the consent over their own choices before the age of 18. Well, there's a word for that too. They're called pedophiles. So it's like, all roads seem to come back to this panacea of just let parents have the final say in their children's lives, and more than likely these problems will solve themselves.
Mm-hmm. Especially like as we were talking with entertainment in general, with animation and that being pushed onto kids. I'm sorry to bring that thing up again. And also with including pedophilia, there's been many people that are working for, let's say, Cartoon Network or even Netflix right now that have done very pedophilic actions, whether that be with creating minors in their artwork, doing it out, or even just like actually having a whole on post history of stalking a child. And that comes like from the creator of this one show called 12 Forever, which obviously for me, seeing that 12 Forever and it being like, oh, she's not growing up, she doesn't want to grow up, and all this kind of stuff, and it's just kind of like, ugh, that don't seem right to me. Like, straightforward, that didn't seem right. But I tried to check it out because the art style looked cool, but as soon as I found out about what the creator done to this one kid, like, literally stalked the kid at an amusement park years back, that was very just, like, gut-wrenching right there, because it's just, no. And you're over here making this kind of content. Yeah, I know what you're trying to do, bud. I'm sorry, but no.
It's everywhere. I mean, it's I know, like, conspiracy theorists, I put that in quote, I call it conspiracy facts, but like, Alex Jones, he's been out there for 20 years, yelling at everybody that like the world's run by pedophiles and there's a pedophile agenda and they're after our kids. And, well, in the past couple of years, people are starting to say, hey, maybe he was onto something, it's, every time you turn over a rock, there seems to be some kind of pedophilia angle to this, and now they're going after our children. So it's our job to protect them. And do whatever it takes to protect them. Just, I urge everybody that, like, don't let the enemies in the gate. I mean, they're everywhere. Like, you need to. I have friends who have big families up where I live now, and they have just a standard policy that they don't. One of them always is watching over their kids, one way or another. They're like chickens watching their flock. It's like they don't let anybody mess with their kids. And it sounds extreme, but when I first met him, I thought, well, that's kind of extreme. And don't you ever get a break? And it's like, no, I understand it now. You have to.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, there are times where, like, that kid has to grow up, obviously, but it's just, like, right now, especially from the ages of, I'd say, from being a newborn, or even, like, in the womb itself to, I'd give or take, maybe 16 for the most part. Like, watch your kids for the most part, because that is definitely, like, a prime age range where stuff happens, whether that be in the school system or just, like, entertainment value. Like, I used to be really into a show called Steven Universe for a long time, but it's just, like, now I really just, like, dislike it. Not only because of some stuff they'd thrown in it, but it's mainly, like, one of the characters, it's like they really want him to off himself on screen. And I'm like, Like, I couldn't do that, and they were doing that to a main character as well. I'm like, nah, I can't watch this anymore. It's too depressing. But you have it where it has a huge fan base.
Yeah, and that's so irresponsible. I mean, who would want to make a show that would be promoting that? I mean, children are impressionable by nature. They know that. They're taking advantage of that. Yeah. Well, should we try to keep this at a length where we can hold people's interest to the end, or?
I think that's about all, unless you have anything else you'd like to add, like red flags to tell the people to watch out for or anything like that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm actually, if I had better video skills, which I am slowly working on, I would like to make a video about that. There are a lot of red flags. I will say this, I could go on probably too long about it, but basically, if you have a son and your son is having interests in what are traditionally girls' interests, like let's just say dolls or princesses or such, it might seem harmless. And I know a lot of parents will just go, well, this is what I did. I'm like, oh, he'll just grow out of it. And it's okay. It's, once puberty hits, his whole alignment will change. Unfortunately, you don't have the luxury of taking that stance. Because there are other people out there, especially if your child is going to a public school or kind of interacting with some of these institutions, there are people out there constantly watching for that. And then what they'll do is they'll use it as a reason to start separating you from your child. And there are laws being put in place, and they're actually being practiced in some places where, like in Canada, there was a kind of a precedent-setting case that happened recently where a father is in a very similar situation as mine, where he's pushing back against the puberty blockers, and the state came in and ruled that that he doesn't have the right to stop it, and it can all get started because your child was looking like they're presenting in a different way, and then that empowers people outside of your family to basically override your authority. I mean, I hope I explained that correctly. So it's like, you have to be really, like, it could be all innocent. No child, every toy and interest doesn't just come along with a name tag on it saying this is for girls and this is for boys. I mean, it's very natural that children just kind of, have their interests, and they come and they go and they fade, and they want to be Superman one day and they want to be something else another day. But if they present in the other gender at the wrong time in front of the wrong people, this can quickly get out of your control. And so I would say that in general is a red flag you really need to be careful about. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Like, I totally agree with that. Even, like, as a kid who grew up a tomboy, definitely agree with that circumstance, because, like, there are times, like, a kid can grow out of those things, but you have other people, they may pressure those things onto kids.
Yes, yeah. You don't know how many times I've heard since I've taken on this I don't know, campaign, I guess we'll call it. People have said, if this was going on when I was a child, I would have gotten wrapped up, in this epidemic. And it's true. I mean, I think back in my childhood, I mean, I probably still have kind of an obsessive personality. There might be a genetic component to it, but if I would have gotten obsessed in the wrong thing and I would have been directed in the wrong way, and this was going on when I was 10 years old, I mean, so it kind of becomes there by the grace of God go I. It's like a lot of us are here now able to fight this back, hopefully to save the upcoming generations, because this was not implemented yet. I mean, it's up to us. It's our responsibility, and we need to save future generations from this problem.
Agreed. Definitely agree with that.
Well, thank you so much for contacting me and taking the time to talk, and I really appreciate it. And if you ever want to talk again, if there's a follow-up that could be had or something, please, call me again, and I'm happy to come and talk to you.
Yeah, definitely, and thank you for letting me have you on. It's a real pleasure to actually be able to discuss this, especially at, now it's 54 minutes long, so that's an excellent marker stop right there, I guess you could say. But really, just thank you so much for having this conversation with me and having this put out there for people to see, despite how small the audience may be. At least people are listening into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
You're
Anytime.
Alrighty. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.